There's a grading myth that almost every collector eventually is going to hear, and that is that coins graded mint state 67 are simply the cleanest mint state examples. In other words, that they are just the nicest looking coins from the mint. But that explanation is actually incomplete, because many coins that look nearly perfect still fail to reach mint state 67. And the reason why reveals something extremely important about how grading actually works. It also explains why the population of coins at this level becomes incredibly small. Let's start with something that surprises many people when they first realize it. Morgan dollars were struck in the hundreds of millions of coins. For some dates, the production numbers are absolutely enormous. Yet, when you look at grading populations, you see a very strange and interesting pattern. Coins graded mint state 63 are pretty much everywhere. Coins graded mint state 64 are also really extremely common. Even coins graded mint state 65 still exist in fairly large numbers. But once you move beyond those levels, something dramatic happens. The population begins to collapse. Coins graded mint state 66 become much harder to find. Coins graded MS67 become genuinely scarce. And coins graded MS68 may exist only in extremely tiny numbers, sometimes just dozens of examples. So the obvious question becomes, why do so few coins survive at that level? And what exactly separates an MS64 or an MS65 coin from something that reaches mint state 67? Let's try a real comparison. Here are two Morgan dollars. At first glance, they may look very similar. Both appear bright. Both appear sharply struck. Both clearly qualify as mint state coins. But only one of them realistically qualifies for MS67 level grading. The other one does not. Throughout this video, we're going to examine both coins closely under the microscope. And by the end, you should be able to see exactly what graders are looking for. When you submit a coin to one of the professional services for grading, the first thing the graders are going to examine is the presence and distribution of contact marks. The reality is, every mint state coin has them. Unless there's an inherent flaw in the planchet being struck, when coins are struck at the mint, they are essentially perfect, unless it's a weak strike or other, some type of a die imperfection. But assuming it comes off the press in pristine condition, it then gets dumped into bins. From there, it gets transferred into bags. And during transport, those bags may hold as many as 1,000 or more coins. Every time those bags shift, every time they're thrown on a truck and driven to a new location, every time that truck runs over a bump in the road or a pothole, those bags shift. They then hit the bank. They get taken off the truck, thrown onto a pallet, then unloaded into a vault. The coins, they collide with each other. And over time, this creates tiny abrasions across the surface. So what the graders are looking for And what the question they're trying to answer is not whether a coin has marks. The question is where those marks are located. Because marks in certain areas have a much greater visual impact than marks in others. Now we move to one of the most important of the grading concepts, focal areas. These are the parts of the coin where the human eye naturally focuses first. On Morgan dollars, the most dominant focal area is the cheek. When collectors first examine a Morgan dollar, their eye almost always goes directly to this region. That means even small abrasions here can have a dramatic visual impact. Let's look closely at coin A. Another very important grading factor is something called surface continuity. As discussed, when coins are stored together in bags, they often develop these tiny abrasions across the open fields. These marks can scatter light in different directions and disrupt the overall visual flow of the surface. Lower statement grades frequently show this type of disturbance. As coins approach the gem category, those interruptions become less common. And by the time a coin reaches mint state 67, the fields appear noticeably calmer more often than not. Now, that does not mean the surface is completely flawless, but the interruptions become extremely limited, and the overall visual impression becomes much smoother. Now, surface marks are only part of the grading equation. Luster plays an equally important role. When a coin is struck, microscopic flow lines form across the metal surface. These flow lines create the reflective cartwheel effect we see when the coin is rotated like this. Now, what we mean by cartwheel effect is, for instance, this area right here. When you see the light maintain that position as it makes its way around the surface of the coin, it almost looks like a little cartwheel. And you can see it again right down here, with this area of the coin maintaining that cartwheel luster all the way around. Same thing up here at the top. For high-grade coins, that luster should remain strong and consistent across the entire surface. If the luster appears broken, or if it looks uneven, that can reduce the maximum grade the graders are willing to assign. Notice how both coins still display strong luster, but the cleaner surfaces of coin B allow that luster to appear more continuous. But here is where the comparison becomes even more interesting, because there is actually a third coin in this group, and that coin graded at the MS67 level. At first glance, it may appear similar to the others, but once we examine it closely, we can see how subtle differences begin to really separate these coins. At the MS67 level, graders begin evaluating something beyond simple condition. They're evaluating survivorship. Out of the tens or hundreds of millions of coins struck each year at different mints, how many could realistically survive the minting and storage process without significant surface damage? The answer is usually very few. Looking at this coin, you can see that while there are still abrasions, as is very common with any mint state coin of this era, they're relatively few and relatively shallow. Importantly, they don't show any dense concentration of marks that detract or compete with the focal areas. The hairline above the ear fully struck. The reality is, most coins accumulate marks long before they ever leave the mint, which means that only a fraction, and a tiny fraction at that, maintain the level of surface preservation necessary to achieve a mint state 67 grade. Even abrasions like that out in the field, which I would consider to be a little bit more serious. It's a little bit larger. It definitely breaks the surface of the coin, and the impact seems to be a little bit deeper. But notice how the rest of the fields on the reverse are remarkably quiet. The eagle itself, very nicely developed breast feathers, full strike. And throughout the field, except for that one area on the right, the fields on this coin are relatively absent of any significant marks. And that's what the graders are looking for to have a coin survive the very difficult and hard to achieve mint state 67 level. Okay, now that we've examined the surfaces closely, take another look at these three coins. Which one do you think reached the highest grade? Look carefully at the cheek. Look at the open fields. Study how the luster moves across the surface. The differences may seem subtle, but they are exactly what graders are focusing on. This coin graded mint state 64. The scattered focal marks and the surface interruptions are what prevent this coin from reaching gem grade status. Some of the fields are relatively quiet, but importantly, the primary focal area of the cheek and the face area has some significant impact marks. And the next impact, or the next big focal area of the fields, again, has some significant marks and chatter. And in some cases, they're relatively concentrated. And they definitely detract from some of the eye appeal. They compete with the eye going to the focal areas, as it should. On the reverse, you can see some damage to the eagle wing. On the left, you can see some impact to the fields on the right, both sides of the wreath. Otherwise, the fields are relatively clean on the reverse. But overall, that's why this coin reached its limit at mint state 64. Now this coin graded mint state 67. Notice how the focal areas remain much cleaner. Despite there still being a few impact marks, they're relatively shallow, and they're not very concentrated. They're fairly well spread out and limited. Looking at the fields, they appear significantly calmer and quieter than on the mint state 64 example. Detail strike to the hair is beautiful. Primary focal area of the cheek and face, relatively free of major distractions and no real major concentrations. Flipping to the reverse, again, we've got some damage on the eagle's wing on the left, but unlike on the other coin, not as deep, not as significant. And because it's in the relief area of detail like that, it doesn't show up as easily. The eye isn't drawn to it as much as if it was something in the fields. We do have some noise in the fields, but overall, look at how much quieter the fields are on this MS67 compared to the 64 we looked at a minute ago. All right, now this coin also graded mint state 67. And as you can see, the focal areas remain much cleaner and the fields remain much calmer. There's really only a few minor strikes out in the field like that in front of the nose. As far as the primary focal area, you've only got a few very minor strikes to the cheek and chin area. Couple down by the neck, again, nothing significant, nothing terribly deep, and not very concentrated in numbers. Out in the fields, you see very, very little in the way of impact marks. They are there, but they're not very large, and they don't distract the eye. On the reverse, again, fields with one main exception right there on the right, remarkably clean. Eagle's feathers, breast feathers, fully defined, well struck, no impact marks to the eagle, very few impact marks in the field to the left, one small impact to the right of the eagle's head, and that impact out there on the right next to the arrow tips. And other than that, this coin has almost a flawless reverse. Most mint state coins stall before reaching the mint state 67 level. Not because they circulated, but because the mint itself was a harsh environment. Coins collide with each other thousands of times during production and storage. Only a tiny fraction escape that process with minimal surface damage. Those rare survivors, they become the elite examples collectors pursue. And once you understand that, the population reports start to make a lot more sense.